The wagon came up Kestrel Creek Road a little after 9, back when the frost was still smoking off the fence posts and the mud hadn't softened enough yet to slow a wheel down. Ruth heard it before she saw it. Two horses pushed too hard, a driver who didn't know how to take a bend without hauling on the reins like he meant to break something. She was already on the porch. Had been most of the morning, a small boot in her lap, working a needle through the leather where the heel stitching had torn loose again. She didn't stop when the wagon swung into the yard. She finished the stitch, bit the thread clean. Only then did she stand. The man who climbed down was built through the shoulders the way his brother used to be, though heavier now, softer around the jaw. Dressed like someone who did his business behind a desk and not from a saddle. There was a paper folded inside his coat. She could make out its shape before he ever pulled it free. "Morning," he said. She didn't return it. Beside her, a small hand found hers without being asked. It had learned to do that over the winter, quick and sure. 5 years old and already fluent in the particular cold that comes over a room before anyone says a word. "I've come for her," the man said, the way a fellow reads out a bill of sale. "She's Voss family, belongs on the ranch now that my brother's gone. I've got the wagon and I intend to have her home before dark." The frost had already burned off the porch boards. Somewhere behind the house, a hen was making a fuss about nothing in particular. Ruth looked at the paper in his hand and didn't reach for it. "I have a letter," she said. That stopped him, the particular blink of a man who expects a door to give and finds it locked instead. A letter in his own hand, written before he died, naming me her guardian. She said it the way she said most things. No more weight on the words than the words themselves could carry. Not her keeper, not her minder through a hard season. Guardian, that isn't what I've got. No, she said, it isn't. The little hand tightened around hers. She kept her eyes on him, on the two horses blowing steam into the cold morning. And for one unhurried second, she thought of a night back in November when a dying man had sat at her own table. Hat turning in both hands, and asked her for something no stranger had any right to ask. She'd said yes before she understood the size of what she was agreeing to. She understood it now. "She stays," Ruth said. The hen went on complaining. The horses shifted, restless in their traces. He stood there a long moment with the paper still folded, unopened between them, like a door neither one of them had yet decided to walk through. A week before the wagon, the snow had only just begun to give. Not gone, only soft at the edges, dripping off the eaves through the warm part of the day and freezing again by supper. So the yard turned to glass every morning, and Ruth had to walk Etta to the privy, holding her under the arms like a sack of feed corn. Dr. Abernathy came riding a gray gelding she didn't recognize, borrowed from the livery since his own horse had gone lame back in January and never come sound again. She saw him from the window before he'd reached the gate, and her first thought, fast, plain, was that something had gone wrong with the child's chest. The cough that had come and mostly gone in December. He didn't ask after the girl at all. He stood in the yard with his hat still on, which told her something before he'd said a single word, and drew an envelope from inside his coat. Soft at the corners from handling, the wax cracked but unbroken. "He gave me this the second week of December," Abernathy said, "told me to hold on to it. Said if the winter went the way he expected, I was to bring it to you the moment it thawed." She took it, heavier than she'd guessed, warm from riding against his body the whole way out. "You knew," she said, not a question. "I knew he was dying before you did," Abernathy answered. "I knew before he ever told you what he wanted from you." She didn't open it out there. She went inside, set it on the table where small hands couldn't reach, and put the kettle on because her own hands needed something to do besides shake. The doctor stood in the doorway and came no further, the cold pooling around his boots. When she finally broke the seal, her hands had steadied. She read it fast the first time, the way a person reads bad news, then slow the second. It wasn't a letter asking her to mind a child through a rough patch. It was written in a hand gone thin with fever, dated the 8th of December, naming her by full intention, guardian, not temporary, not till spring. Not until some cousin came riding out to collect what belonged to him. Guardian, she read the word 3 times before it settled anywhere. Abernathy watched her face the whole while, the way a man watches weather rolling in over a ridge, already certain what it means before the first drop lands. "He never told me this," she said. No, the doctor said. I don't imagine he told you much of anything he expected you'd argue about. Outside. Thin laughter came through the wall, Etta chasing the hen around the yard. And Ruth sat very still at her own table with a dead man's handwriting between her fingers, understanding for the first time exactly what she'd agreed to back in November, and what it was going to cost her to keep it. Before the letter, before any of it, really, there was a Saturday in late February, cold enough that the church hall smelled of wet wool and coffee scorched black on the stove. Ruth hadn't wanted to go. She went because not going would have said more than showing up ever could. Etta wore the blue dress, collar starched stiff from washing, and stood close against Ruth's skirt the way she'd learned to stand back in September and never once unlearned. Somebody had strung paper lanterns from the rafters. Somebody's fiddle was being tuned badly in the corner. A woman in a wide gray coat, the kind whose voice carried whether she meant it to or not, set down her cup before the room had quite finished its own noise. Isn't that the Voss girl? Not really a question. The kind of sentence built to resemble one so it could be denied later. Ruth didn't stop cutting the cake. She's staying with me a while. A while. The woman turned the word over like she was weighing coin. It's been since first snow. Roads were bad. Roads clear by January. Some roads don't, Ruth said, plain as quoting the price of a harness repair, and went back to slicing. It wasn't an answer. Both women knew it wasn't. But it was the sort of not answer a town could live around without picking at. The way folks leave a splinter under the skin rather than dig for it in company. Etta's fingers found Ruth's skirt and held on. Nothing else happened, which was its own kind of thing. The fiddle found its key. Coffee got poured. Someone asked after Ruth's harness work, and she gave a plain answer. And the room drifted on toward whatever a room drifts toward once it's decided not to look too hard at something. Walking home after, the road was in fact fine, packed hard, frozen clean through. The kind a wagon could take without any trouble at all. Etta walked half a step behind, watching her own boots break the crust of old snow. "Why'd you say the roads?" she asked. Ruth kept walking, her breath going out white and long. "Because it was easier than the truth for a room full of people who don't need it." "What's the truth?" She didn't answer right away. Overhead the sky had gone that flat gray it wore before more snow. Behind them the lantern light was already dimming as the hall emptied out. "The truth's mine to keep a while longer," Ruth said finally. "Same as you are." Etta didn't ask again. She slipped her mittened hand into Ruth's, and they walked the rest of the way home with the frozen road cracking faint beneath their boots. The paper roofs of the town dimming behind them toward true dark. Earlier that winter's first week of February, when the snow had stopped being a novelty and settled into being simply a fact of life, Etta came in from the yard with her coat sleeve torn at the cuff. A long, ragged pull where a fence nail had caught it. Ruth looked at it the way she looked at any harness leather that came through her door. Not alarm, appraisal. "Sit," she said, nodding toward the chair by the stove. She could have mended it herself in 4 minutes flat. She'd fixed worse in less. Instead, she pulled her sewing basket onto the table, the one with the bone-handled needle case that had belonged to her own mother, and set out 2 needles instead of 1. "Thread this," she said, and handed over a spool and a needle with an eye wide enough for small fingers. Etta licked the thread the way she'd watched Ruth do it, twisted it to a point, and missed the eye 4 times before catching it. She glanced up once, checking, but Ruth was already threading her own needle, not watching at all. "Small stitches," Ruth told her, "close together. Don't pull it tight or it'll pucker." Etta bent over the sleeve with her tongue caught between her teeth. Her first stitches ran wide and uneven, the fabric bunching where she'd cinched too hard, the line wandering like a fence built by somebody learning the trade as they went. She looked up again, bracing for correction. Ruth glanced at the work and didn't take it from her, didn't unpick a single stitch. "Keep going," she said. By the time the cuff closed, the seam ran crooked its whole length, dipping, rising, 3 stitches bunched tight in one spot, and a gap wide enough to see daylight through in another. Etta held it up like she was waiting for a verdict the way she waited for weather. "That'll hold," Ruth said, and turned the sleeve right side out and hung the coat back on its peg by the door. She didn't restitch it that night. Didn't touch it the next morning either, when the coat went back onto small shoulders and out into the cold to feed the chickens. the crooked seam holding exactly as promised, ugly and sound. Etta wore that coat 3 more weeks before the sleeve wanted mending again, and every time she caught sight of that cuff, pulling it on, folding it over a chair back. Tucking her hands in against the wind, something small and private crossed her face, like she was checking the crooked line was still there. It always was. Ruth noticed the checking, said nothing about it. She only set the basket out again on a Tuesday when nothing needed fixing at all, and asked would she like to try a hem this time, and Etta said yes before the question had even finished. Already reaching for the wide-eyed needle. Before the coat ever needed its first mending, there was January, and a cold snap that split a fence post in the yard like a rifle shot in the dead of night. Ruth heard the crack and thought little of it. Wood did that in deep cold. She banked the stove, checked the latch, went back to bed. It was the second sound that pulled her fully awake. Smaller, closer, coming from Etta's cot on the far side of the curtain. Not crying, not quite. A kind of catching, over and over, breath snagging on something before it came back out. She was across the room before she decided to move. Etta sat upright in the dark, blankets pooled at her waist, eyes open and fixed on nothing. Both hands pressed flat against her own knees, the way a person braces for a jolt they already know is coming. "Bad dream," Ruth said, not a question. She sat on the edge of the cot, the rope frame groaning under the added weight. Etta didn't answer right off. Outside, the wind had found the loose board on the north wall again and was working it, a low, steady groan underneath the house's ordinary noises. "Papa's coughing," Etta said. "Sounds like the well pump." Ruth went very still. "When it sticks in the cold," the girl said, "that grinding sound it makes before the water comes." She said it plain, the way she might report the weather or count eggs in the coop. "He'd cough like that at night, long ones, then it'd stop and I'd wait to hear if it started up again." Ruth didn't ask how long. Didn't ask how many nights, how many winters, how much of this small life had already been spent listening through a wall for the next grinding breath. She reached over and drew the blanket back up over the thin shoulders instead, tucking the edge the way she tucked coat sleeves before the cold could get at them. "It's only the wind tonight," she said, "not a pump. Not a cough." "I know," Etta said, in a voice that suggested she'd known the whole time, had simply needed to say the true thing out loud once to somebody who wouldn't flinch from hearing it. Ruth sat with her until the breathing evened and the small hands unclenched from the blanket's edge, and the house settled back into its ordinary creaking dark. Then she banked the stove again, though it didn't need it, and lay awake a long while listening to that same loose board, thinking that a well pump, once you'd learned to hear it that way, wasn't a sound a person could easily unhear either. The knock came 3 nights before the new year, late enough that Ruth had already banked the stove and blown out the front room lamp. She knew Dr. Abernathy's knock by then, 2 short raps, a pause, one more. The habit of a man who'd spent 30 years announcing himself at houses where sickness lived, careful not to sound urgent even when he was. She lit the lamp again and went to the door in her shawl. He stood on the step with snow catching in his hat brim, his bag hanging from one hand like it had grown heavier since morning. His breath came out white and slow. "He's gone," he said. "Sometime this afternoon, best as I can figure. Found him in the chair by the stove. Hadn't been dead long when I got there." Ruth said nothing at first. Behind her, the house held its ordinary quiet, Etta asleep in the back room, the wind still working that same loose board. "Alone," she said, not a question. "Sent his hired man into town for supplies 3 weeks back and told him not to hurry home. Told the boy who does his chores to take the week off for Christmas. Man wanted to be by himself for it." Abernathy shifted his bag to the other hand. "I expect he knew what he was doing. Sent her off to you back in November so she wouldn't have to watch. I expect that's right too." Snow came down past the lamplight in loose. Unhurried flakes, the kind that meant a long fall of it, not a storm. Ruth stood in the doorway with the cold working past her ankles and thought of the girl 3 rooms away. Asleep with her hands still curled the way they curled when she was listening for something in a wall. "Does anyone else know? His brother by morning. I sent word out to the ranch before I rode here." Abernathy glanced past her toward the dark hall, though there was nothing there to see. "Didn't say a word about the girl. Wasn't my business to." "No," Ruth said. "It isn't." He nodded once, the way a man nods when he's finished the hard part of his job and is glad to be done with it, and turned back toward his horse, standing patient in the snow with its head hung low. Ruth closed the door soft enough the latch made no sound at all. She stood a long moment in the lamplight, listening to the house the way she'd taught herself to listen these past weeks, for breathing, for coughing, for the particular silence that meant a child was awake and only pretending otherwise. There was none of that tonight, only wind and the stove ticking as it cooled and her own decision arriving before she'd finished making it. She wouldn't tell her tonight. Not with the snow only just starting, and 3 weeks of quiet Christmas still sitting undisturbed in that small face. She banked the stove, though it didn't need it, and went to bed and did not sleep. 3 weeks before that, the snow hadn't started yet, and Emmett Voss could still sit upright at his own kitchen table long enough to write a letter. He did it alone, the fire kept low because he'd stopped asking his hired man to build it high. The heat made his chest work harder some nights, and he'd learned to prefer the cold. December the 14th. He wrote the date out of old habit, the way he'd dated every ledger entry for 11 years, and sat looking at it a while before writing anything else. The letter was short. He'd never been a man given to length in anything, and dying hadn't changed that. He named her not by her trade, not by the shape of her circumstance, but by her full name. The ink dark where he'd pressed too hard at the start, and thinner by the end where his hand had begun to tire. He wrote that she was to have the raising of his daughter, not the keeping of her, a distinction he underlined once, the only word in the whole letter he underlined. He wrote that this was made while his mind was fully his own, and he'd swear it before any man who doubted it, though he supposed he wouldn't be there to swear anything by the time it mattered. He folded it in thirds, sealed it with a stub of wax kept in the kitchen drawer for jarring preserves, pressed his ring into it before he could think better of pressing anything at all, and sat with it in front of him until Abernathy arrived at 4 for the visit that had become daily by then. The doctor read the outside of it, Ruth's name, nothing more, and looked up. "You want this sent?" "I want it held." Abernathy waited. "Unless my brother comes asking," Emmett said. "Then you give it to him to read, and you tell him where she's gone." The pause cost him breath. "Otherwise it's nobody's business but hers, and the girl's someday if she ever wants to know it." The doctor turned the letter once in his hands, feeling the weight of the wax, and slid it inside his coat where the ledger book lived. He didn't ask why Emmett hadn't given it to Ruth directly. He delivered enough dying men's wishes by then to know some things get arranged so the living don't have to carry the asking of them. "She know you're doing this?" "No." Emmett looked toward the window where the light was already going gray though it wasn't yet 5. "She doesn't need the weight of it till there's weight to carry." Outside, the first real cold of the month was settling over the yard, though the snow itself was still 3 weeks off, waiting its own turn to arrive. 3 weeks before that, the brother had come once. He rode in on a gray gelding that hadn't seen a brush in some time, and he let himself into the front room without knocking, where Emmett lay propped against 2 pillows. A blanket pulled to his waist, despite the fire going hard in the hearth. "You look like hell," Cole said. "Feel it too." Cole didn't sit. He stood near the window with his hands loose at his sides, looking over the room like he was pricing it. The furniture, the rifle over the mantel, a child's boots by the door. Small enough to cup in one hand. "Heard you're sending her off to some widow in town. Word travels, word always travels." "It does." Cole turned. "You could send her to me instead. Ranch has got the room, she'd have cousins. She'd have hired hands who forget she's even there by Tuesday." "That's not fair." "No," Cole agreed, "it isn't. Fair went out the window a while back." He was quiet a moment, working his jaw the way he did when deciding whether a thing was worth arguing over. He'd never been a man who raised his voice, never needed to. He had a way of letting silence do the work instead, the same silence that had sat between the two of them since before either had wives. Since before the war took the shine off everything, and left them their same faces but different insides. "You always did this," Cole said finally. "Decide things without asking. I'm asking now. I'm telling you what's already decided." "That's not asking, that's telling." "There's a difference." Emmett shifted against the pillows and something in his chest caught, and he waited it out before he spoke again. "And I haven't got years left to explain it twice." Cole looked at him a long moment. Then he looked toward the door where the small boots sat by the mat, one of them fallen sideways. "She's my blood too, she is. Then I've got some say." "You've got exactly as much say as I give you," Emmett said, "and right now that's none. Come April, if I'm not standing, you're welcome to ride out and ask the widow yourself what she thinks of it. Till then it's her business and mine." Cole's mouth tightened. He set his hat back on, brim low, and for a moment the shape of him in the doorway went young again. The way he'd looked riding off after their father's funeral without a word to anyone, chin up. Certain the world owed him an explanation it was never going to give. "April, then," he said. He didn't say goodbye, didn't look at the boots again. He mounted the gray gelding in the yard and rode off toward the ranch road without once glancing back at the house. Emmett watched him go from the window, one hand pressed flat to his ribs, breath shallow, the fire cracking low behind him. Outside, the cold carried a different weight than it would later, once the snow came and settled and made everything quiet the way deep winter does. This cold was thinner still, restless, coming and going with the wind rather than staying to claim the ground. Emmett watched the dust settle on the road long after the rider had gone, and thought, not for the first time, that April was a long way off. And a man could arrange a great deal in the space between one season and the next. If he moved carefully and didn't waste what time he had left explaining himself to people who'd already decided not to listen. Late November and the snow hadn't come to stay yet. The small boot sat on Ruth's mending table 3 full days before she touched it, small enough to fit in one hand. The leather had gone soft at the toe where a seam had split, pulled loose by a season of running through yard and field, and she'd noticed it the very first evening, kneeling to help with the laces. Feeling the give of it under her thumb. She hadn't said anything then. She'd only set it aside by the lamp where she set things she meant to get to. It stayed there. She mended harness leather all day, traces, cinches, a saddle skirt for a rancher 2 miles east, her hands moving without needing to be watched. The all-in-wax thread, as familiar to her as breathing. That work she did without a second's hesitation. It was paid for. It had an owner who'd come collect it, and a use that would end when the leather wore through again, the way all leather did, the way all things did that were made to be used hard and replaced. The boot was different. She picked it up on the 3rd evening, after Etta had gone to sleep in the back room, the fire settled to coals, the wind working the shutters the way it did most nights that time of year. She turned it over in the lamplight. The split ran an inch along the toe seam, no more the kind of tear that took 10 minutes to close if a person committed to closing it. She threaded a needle. Set the point against the leather. Drew the first stitch through, pulled it tight, the small, familiar sound of thread through leather, no different than any other stitch she'd made that day. Then she stopped. She sat there with the boot in her lap and the needle still threaded and didn't make the second stitch. It wasn't the leather that stopped her. The leather was simple. It was the thought that came behind it, unbidden, the way thoughts do when the hands are busy and the mind's been left alone to wander where it likes. That to finish this seam was to promise the boot would be worn again here, by this fire, through a winter and maybe past it. That she was mending a thing and in mending it, assuming a future for it. Assuming the girl would still be standing in this kitchen in a month, in 2, needing boots that held together. She didn't know that yet. Nobody had told her that yet, not truly, not in words she could carry to the bank of certainty. She set the boot down on the table, one stitch holding, the rest of the seam still open, still asking to be finished, and blew out the lamp and went to bed with the question sitting in the dark, same as the wind sat in the shutters, persistent, unresolved, not going anywhere on its own. In the morning, she picked the harness work back up, the traces, the cinch, the things with certain owners and certain ends. The boot sat where she'd left it, one stitch in, the thread hanging loose from the needle, and she didn't touch it again that day or the day after. Though she looked at it each time she passed the table, the way a person looks at a door they haven't yet decided whether to open. That thread went back further still, back past the wind in the shutters, past the question sitting in the dark, to a Tuesday in early November, the sky the color of a nail. The ground already stiffening under the season's first hard frost. Emmett had come up the road on a horse, breathing harder than it should have, and he was breathing harder than the horse. Ruth had been on the porch beating dust from a rug when she saw him stop at the gate instead of riding on past. He didn't dismount right away. He sat there a moment, one hand pressed flat to his chest like a man holding something in that wanted badly to get out. Then he came down off the horse slow, the way a man comes down when his legs have opinions about it, and walked to the porch steps and stopped there, not coming up onto the boards. Keeping them between them like a line he decided not to cross without asking first. He took a handkerchief from his coat and coughed into it, turning his face away to do it, and when he brought it back down there was a mark on the white cloth that hadn't been there before. He folded the cloth before she could look at it too long. "I've got a daughter," he said, 5 years old, her mother's 3 years gone. Ruth set the rug down. "I need someone to keep her," he said, "till spring, maybe past it." He didn't say why past it might matter more than spring. He didn't have to. The handkerchief was still in his hand, folded now, but she'd already seen it. "I can pay," he said. "I've a deed, 40 head, the good pasture along the creek. It's yours if you'll take her." She looked at him a long while without answering, and he let her, standing there in the frost with his hat in one hand and the horse breathing behind him. The sky the color of a nail over both their heads. "Where's the girl?" "At the Hendersons. Didn't want to bring her out here till I knew." "Knew what?" "If you'd say yes." She was quiet again. A crow passed low overhead, calling once, and neither of them looked up at it. "Can she eat what I eat?" Ruth asked. It wasn't the question he'd braced for. Something moved behind his eyes, a man finding a door where he'd expected only a wall. "She's not particular," he said. "That's not what I asked." "Yes," he said. "She can eat what you eat." Ruth nodded once, the way a person nods over a ledger that finally balances. "Bring her by Thursday," she said. "I'll want to see the deed signed proper. Not just spoken. It'll be signed." He didn't thank her the way a man thanks someone for saving him. He put his hat back on and stood there another moment as though there were something more to say, and then didn't say it. He mounted slower than he'd dismounted, and rode back down the road toward town, and she stood on the porch with the rug forgotten at her feet, watching him go. The frost still climbing the fence posts, the sky pressing down gray and flat and giving nothing away about what was coming. That was November. This was April. The frost was long gone from the fence posts now, and in its place the mud had dried to a soft dust that lifted under boot heels. The fields past the last storefront had gone the pale green of new grass, not yet sure of itself. The road that had carried Emmett away that gray morning had carried, weeks after this one, a wagon and a brother and a paper with a wax seal. And had carried them away again empty, the wheels cutting fresh ruts on the way back toward whatever ranch they'd come from. Ruth hadn't watched Cole go the way she'd watched Emmett go. She'd gone back inside and shut the door, and that had been enough. Now she sat on the porch step with the boot in her lap. The same boot, small, scuffed at the toe. The leather gone soft with a winter's wear, the seam she'd first opened with a candle guttering behind her back in November. A girl asleep in the next room under a quilt that wasn't hers yet. She'd set that first stitch slow that night, testing the leather, testing herself, not knowing yet what she was agreeing to when she agreed to keep it mended. She knew now. The needle went through clean. April light did that to leather, clear and low and unhurried. Nothing like the tallow glow of the deep winter months. Nothing like the flat gray that had pressed down the morning Emmett rode off, without thanking her the way a man thanks someone for saving him. This light came sideways across the porch boards and caught the fine hairs at Etta's temple, her head resting heavy against Ruth's shoulder. One small hand curled loose in the fabric of Ruth's sleeve. Ruth pulled the thread through, knotted it, bit it off close to the leather, the way she'd been taught by someone long dead. Someone whose hands she still felt sometimes moving inside her own when she worked. She turned the boot over once, checking the line of the stitch against the light, the way she checked all her work out of habit. Out of something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief either. It held, she set it down on the step beside her, toe pointed toward the yard and didn't reach for its mate, though it sat waiting in the basket by the door. There would be other seasons. Other souls worn through. Other candles burned down to nothing while she worked by their light. Etta stirred once against her shoulder and went still again, breath slow and even. Her small weight settled the way weight settles once it stopped waiting to be told to move. Down the road, past the fence line, a horse nickered somewhere out of sight, and this time neither of them woke for it. The rug still lay forgotten, just inside the door where she'd left it weeks before. The candle on the rail had burned down and been replaced, and burned down again more times than she'd bothered counting. Ruth sat with the mended boot beside her and the girl against her, and the sun climbed a little higher, and she didn't move to go inside. Not yet, not for a while. If you'd been standing in that yard the morning the wagon came, what would you have said when Cole Voss climbed down with that paper in his coat? Would you have handed him the letter, or would you have made him ask twice, the way Ruth did? Tell me where you're watching this from tonight. I always like knowing how far these stories travel. And if a story like this one is the kind you'd want to hear more of, stay a while. Hit like, subscribe if you haven't, and drop your thoughts down in the comments. I read every one.